Okay, so the more observant of you might have noticed I'm not Simon Staffel. I'm filling in for Simon chairing this session. My name is Rowena Shu. I work for Nominet on Policy and Government Relations. So the overview of this panel is aimed at having a forward-looking approach to explore the relationship of policy and technology and think about how both can be developed in harmony. So I've got a great selection of speakers here today to help me explore this question. I'm just going to quickly introduce them, and we're also going to start with a poll from the audience. So I'll do the introductions first. Directly next to me, I have Andrew Puddifoot, who is chair of the Internet Watch Foundation. He's worked to promote human rights for 20 years with specific expertise in freedom of expression, transparency, and the role of media and digital communications in promoting human rights. Andrew's other roles include chairing the Danish-based NGO, International Media Support, and serving on both the board of the Sigurd Rosing Trust and the European Council for Foreign Relations. He's an entrepreneur, having founded 2 social enterprises, Adapt in 2017 and Global Digital Partners, where he remains the chair, and in which capacity he leads the secretariat for 30-country Freedom Online Coalition. Next to Andrew, we have Lindsay Taylor from BEIS, the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Lindsay is a behavioural economist by background, now helping government to anticipate and prepare for the rapid development of new emerging innovation. She's currently at the Better Regulation Executive, leading the establishment of a new organisation, the Regulatory Horizons Council, which will advise government on areas of regulatory reform to support rapid and safe introduction of technological innovations. Lindsay's previous roles include leading on the emerging technologies and future of the Royal Society, the UK's National Academy of Sciences, Principal Behavioural Insight Researcher at Which, the Consumer Organisation, and Trade and Finance Policy at the Government Office for Science, where she worked on the report which recommended the setup of the FCA's FinTech Sandbox. Next to Lindsay, we have Venus Ali, who is the Associate Director of Policy at Tech UK. Venus oversees Tech UK's work developing and delivering policies to make the UK the best place to start and scale a tech business, as well as examining longer-term issues such as future of work. She's undertaking a fellowship at Cambridge University's Centre for Science, looking at the impact of future work on economy and society. Before joining Tech UK, she worked as an advisor on Home Affairs and Justice in the UK Parliament, and previously worked in the European Union delegations to Morocco and Thailand, where she explores issues such as human rights and democratization. And finally, we have Frederick Donk, the director of the ISOC European Bureau. He's an experienced negotiator and advocate in the telecoms and internet industry. His work focuses on bridging the interests of the public and private sector in order to negotiate policy solutions for the benefits of all parties. Okay, so we're going to start off by polling the audience with Slido. So the question is, does the current state of the technology policy make you feel pessimistic or optimistic about the future? So we're going to take this poll at the start, and then we're going to come back to it after we've had a bit of a discussion to see if anybody has shifted. Okay, so looking fairly pessimistic. Maybe that's a good thing, because perhaps we can persuade you around to optimism by the time we finish. Okay. No, don't get too optimistic, or we won't be able to persuade you. Okay, so I'm going to give this as the first question to the panel as well. How are you feeling about the state of future technology? Are you feeling optimistic about the relationship of policy and technology? Frederick, would you like to start us off?
Oh, thank you very much. You take a risk starting with me, actually, because I would say both. But I'm interested to see how pessimistic people are in this room. But they know a lot, obviously. It really depends. To me, the question is, what kind of internet do we want? What kind of internet do we want to preserve? The internet is made of those 1,000 independent networks that actually have decided freely and on a voluntary basis to interconnect to each other. and to cooperate and to adhere voluntarily on to open internet standards, and that ensure interoperability. So I was describing the internet. The byproduct of the design of the internet is that the internet is decentralized. There is no central control. There are principles that ensure how the internet works. Global reach, end-to-end, the permissionless innovation, the integrity, etc. The reason I'm saying this is that we need now to see how policy and regulations will actually impact that and whether or not we want this to stay. Remember Lessig saying code is law. The design of the internet has generated some behaviors, anonymity, the fact that you can freely inject content. That's a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. So that has generated an answer for policymakers and regulators who want to regulate the behaviors. But in doing so, there might be unintended consequence on the network itself. And I have a zillion examples that I can share. I won't hijack the conversation now, but that is exactly what makes me a bit pessimistic, and that is that there might be good intention in regulating behaviors of citizens on the internet that might have an impact on the core of the internet. And for us, from an internet perspective, fragmentation, be it technical fragmentation, policy fragmentation, or commercial fragmentation, is the ultimate bad stuff that might happen to the internet.
Okay.
That would be my first answer.
So one for pessimism.
A little bit, yes.
I might go to Lindsay next as a behavioural economist and someone who's playing a role in helping government be better at horizon scanning and looking forward and joining those dots between policy and technology. Are you feeling pessimistic or optimistic?
So I'd probably say on a personal level, I'm very much a tech optimist. That's not to say that I think that tech's going to solve all of our problems. Tech is obviously neutral, but we do have the opportunity to design, create and progress technology for good to solve some of our most pressing challenges. So policy is just one lever to do that, much like regulation is too. In June this year, my organisation published a white paper on regulation for the fourth industrial revolution, and that kind of sets out 6 challenges around regulation and how it can be more enabling of innovation. So one of those challenges was how we could be on the front foot. So I'm currently, as already mentioned, setting up a new organisation in government called the Regulatory Horizons Council. And this organisation will use futures and horizon scanning to look into the future. So it will help government to get on the front foot and to make recommendations on areas for regulatory reform that will support the rapid and safe introduction of technologies. So it's also initiatives like this that kind of enable me to feel optimistic. So I feel like these issues are being thought about kind of at the right levels and by the right people. And I'd probably just add that I'm a futurist in my day job. I'm a science fiction writer in my spare time, so I spend a lot of time in the future. And I think it's kind of human nature to focus on negatives and dystopias a lot of the time, but we are capable of finding the good. I think as Peter Drucker says, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I think it's on all of us to create a future which works for everyone. And I think the best way to do that is to utilise the kind of levers that we have available, like policy and regulation.
Thank you. That's much more uplifting. Andrew, would you like to go next?
Yeah, well, to quote somebody else, technology is neither good nor bad, but nor is it neutral. And I think the question faces, we've had a period where technology has been very transformative of life. It's democratised speech and content. It's had a massive impact on health, education, work, the wider economy, and those effects have been generally very beneficial. But we have hit a series of bumps in the road and problems across a number of those areas. And certainly in the field of content, child sex abuse, the area that my organisation deals with, is probably the worst, the most complex area to deal with. But if we can deal with those problems, then I think there's plenty of room for optimism. I think the problem is the public debate, which I think is fueled by media organisations that hate the internet because they've lost their business model to the advertising revenue shifting online, means that there's a very dystopian mood. in public discussion. That's driving politicians in particular to take very knee-jerk and ill-informed statements and often reactions to phenomena they see online. And I would separate out politicians from officials, who I think are often much better informed. And I think if we need to change the tenor of that public debate and recognise that this is actually a brilliant set of technologies. There are some serious issues and challenges being thrown up by them, but let's tackle them constructively and actually deal with them piece by piece, rather than slip into some pessimistic mood of dystopianism.
So I guess I would echo what Andrew said. I mean, perhaps it's obvious, being the sort of voice of the tech sector, that I would be very optimistic about the future. And I think that potentially is because we're not in a great place right now. I think, when the internet was born, we were all very excited. Governments were very keen to embrace it, and now we're seeing the pendulum swing the other way, and we're seeing the sort of dystopian mood and this pessimistic mood sort of in the public debate, in the debates that happen in the House of Commons and the House of Lords and elsewhere. And I think that is partly driven by a lack of understanding, but also is industry's fault in the sense of we are clearly not doing a good enough job yet in communicating the opportunities that tech allows, and communicating also that industry itself is thinking very carefully about the challenges that are coming down the road, whether it's sort of the encryption debate when you've got quantum computing coming down the line, whether it's the issue around sort of DOH or future of work or automation or whatever it might be. But I'm optimistic because I think now the pendulum has swung so far in the opposite direction. What you'll see is the optimists and the pessimists having that debate in a very public manner, and that feeding down almost into the general debate. And where we'll settle, hopefully, is that nuanced, informed public debate that leads to good policy outcomes, good regulatory objectives. And I think we're already starting to see that at the officials level, who are doing really excellent work in thinking about some of those issues, whether it's in the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, whether it's the Regulatory Horizons Council that's being set up. So I think we're already seeing the sort of institutions of the future that will allow us to have these debates in a really sensible manner, and taking in all the nuances.
So perhaps it's a bit more complicated than pessimistic and optimistic.
Yeah.
Thanks. So you've touched upon some of the things that Lindsay was talking about in terms of what can we implement now to make sure things work better in the future. And some of the issues that have come up again and again today, DOH being one of them, I think is quite an interesting example to think about. It was perhaps an example of where policy and technology weren't connecting as well as they should, and things were happening in silos or in isolation. And maybe with the benefit of hindsight, we could reflect on what could we have done differently, or what could we learn from in that example. Not that it's a finished debate, but just what would you point to as saying, perhaps we could implement this, or perhaps we could do this, that would help policy and technology talk together, have the right people having the right conversations at the right time, to allow those really effective policies that achieve the outcomes that we're kind of agreeing on. Andrew's nodding. Would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting issue, because I think that the people who developed DOH and the impetus behind Facebook Messenger being encrypted are driven by quite legitimate desires to provide greater privacy, greater security, and enhanced encryption. And I think those obviously have a welcome side to them, because the current DNS system is not wholly secure and can be hacked and phished. The problem is there's no absolute right to privacy in human rights terms, and if the consequence of building a DOH system is that films of a baby with an umbilical cord still being attached, being raped for the pleasure of a man somewhere else in the world, are more available, or a young baby is lying there and someone does a toolbox and pulls out a pair of pliers and a screwdriver and shows the tools they're going to use to penetrate that baby's vagina, which is the kind of images we see every day, and there are thousands of them, hundreds of thousands of them, maybe 150,000 men in Britain every year accessing images of that kind. That's not a price that is worth paying for an absolute encrypted communication system. So we have to find a way, I think, of building and developing enhanced privacy and encryption, while allowing either a combination of technical and legal means to identify and detect illegal images of that kind and prevent them being put out there online. Because if we don't do that, we're really facilitating the abuse of children on an industrial scale around the world. And one of the things I found is very interesting, moving as I did in my work from a wholly internet freedom background, which I still have one foot in, to a child protection background, is that there's no communication in civil society between those communities. So there's very little, in my opinion, and my colleagues here might disagree with me, but there's very little awareness in the internet freedom community of the types of images and material that is available online. And if you look at Snowden's article in The Guardian last week, he was pretty dismissive of government concerns about DOH, saying it was really about harvesting people's private data rather than dealing with genuine issues of child exploitation. And I just think he just can't know what's out there, or he either doesn't know or doesn't care what's out there, if he can say that without addressing those kind of concerns. And on the child protection side, equally, there's a sense that, you know, when you're looking at images like that every day and removing them and working to remove them, and that will be true for the police, for you, the internet is awash with filth. That's all the internet is a giant sewer filled with horrible things. And so we have to bring those communities of debate together, and we have to say, can we develop greater privacy, greater security, greater encryption, but at the same time ensure that illegal behaviour which viciously exploits people who are in no position to retaliate or respond can be protected. Now, there may be some technical solutions and maybe a combination of technical and policy. And the fact is, I think when people build stuff, they don't necessarily think through the consequences of it. They're not necessarily, an engineer who's building an encrypted system is thinking, I'm helping human rights people around the world. I'm doing a great thing. They're not addressing or thinking about what they're facilitating elsewhere. And those are the kind of conversations that need to happen in civil society, in the engineering community, in companies and between companies and government and policymakers.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe to bring, I tend to agree with you, maybe to bring a little bit of context for this conversation about DOH or more globally about encryption. Let's step back in 2014 after the Snowden revelations when the IGF, so I guess everybody is here familiar with the IGF, when the IGF declared at that time that pervasive monitoring is a technical attack and that needs to be mitigated in the protocols themselves by the IGF. That was a strong statement. So everything that followed was exactly a follow-up to that decision. That was not a political decision. It was a really technical conversation. DOH, there is still much to learn about it, honestly. I know it's very controversial. Even in our community, we have mixed feelings. There are positive indeed, as you say, much privacy, much security in the standards, but also there is a shift from the trust from the network operators to the web. Browser. So do we agree with this? Yes, no. That's another conversation. So it's still very controversial. What I would like to emphasize is precisely the unintended consequence that I was emphasizing a few seconds ago, encryption. End-to-end encryptions, we know that it protects and it brings security in the exchange of information between people. Yet, there are conversations all over the place, and including in this country, to weaken that encryption. The unintended consequence might be that actually you would weaken what brings security. It's not just privacy versus security. That's an old dichotomy. And we no longer talk about that. It's security versus security. So weakening encryption would weaken the internet reliability, the integrity of the internet itself. So I hear many people say, yeah, but then we could have legitimate kind of breaking the encryption system. But this legitimate would also bring weakness into the whole chain, because if you create weaknesses, you create vulnerabilities. So there are so many ways that the conversation, including in this country, that has so much imagination, I must say, at all level of policy recently, but including in encryption. When I hear people saying, yeah, we might invent something that's called ghost user, and that would be nothing that would touch upon encryption, that would just allow the government to be in the middle of a conversation between two people, because this is nothing with, well, I might develop on the technical side on what it means in reality. It's just having the government in the middle of a conversation which is end-to-end encrypted. But again, that also touch upon the core internet and the reliability of the whole internet. That's what I mean by those decisions that might actually weaken and impact the core internet.
And I think you can only get to discussing those unintended consequences if you're able to bring people in a room in a sort of safe environment to have those conversations, to go to the edges of those really difficult questions and explore it. And I think, so firstly, there needs to be trust and confidence between partners, whether it's industry and government, whether it's civil society and industry, or whatever it might be. But also it must mean that all the people in that room have the same level of technical expertise, and I think that's something that's often lacking. Is that, is everyone conscious of exactly what the technical detail is, and if you break something here, or you're breaking something elsewhere down the chain or further down the ecosystem. And so I think it's really important that firstly that those in government have the right skills to be able to engage in this conversation at a technical level. And that they're able to brief ministers about this as well, who are often, the driving force of changes, whether it's in the encryption debate or elsewhere, but also to create the space in the first place to have those really difficult conversations.
I just want to quickly come in and say, both of you raised some really good points. I think the technical skills is an interesting one, because absolutely we need people who are making policies to understand the technology that they're making policies for. But those aren't the only skills that we need to solve some of the problems that we're facing. And more, I think we're hearing we need really a multidisciplinary approach to what are human issues that are amplified by technology. Is there not perhaps an onus on industry as well to help educate civil servants? How could we, or to educate ministers? Are there some kind of ideas around what we could do to help bring those two areas together?
So that kind of speaks to the point I was going to raise, actually. So I think it goes beyond the kind of technical skills in developing the right communication skills and developing facilitation skills, because this is about bringing people together. And I think ultimately government are responsible for the safety of its citizens, as well as for the economy, and making sure that, tech is delivering financially and all those kind of things. And I think it's a very difficult balance to strike, and I think it does go wider than the technical. It is about kind of thinking about the social and the ethical, thinking about, bringing people together in the communication.
I mean, we heard from Ofcom this morning that there's clearly still a lot of areas that the general public don't understand about technology and how their data is being used.
Yeah, I mean that the level of public debate needs to be better informed, for sure. And I think the online harms paper, white paper that's currently being consulted on by government, is a really good example of that, whereby it's sort of mainly focused in on, okay, what are the legislative changes that need to be made? What are the new regulations we can put in place? I know that there was a conversation earlier around sort of duty of care, etc. But actually, there was only about 10 pages of that 100-page white paper that was dedicated to education. And on a lot of the issues that the white paper tackles, whether it's cyberbullying, trolling, those are people sitting behind screens, and those. So therefore, it's about, okay, well, digital civility, digital resilience. All of those play a role. So it's not about just sort of the technical, but also about the very human as well.
Definitely. Okay. Andrew, I just want to come back to what you were raising before, because I think you gave us quite a sombering but realistic view of the issues that your organisation deals with on a day-to-day basis. And the IWF has occupied quite a unique position where you have this technical understanding, but you also have trust of government and citizens, and you've really done some quite amazing things. I was wondering if you wanted to reflect on what you think it is that has made the IWF operate successfully in your role, and also what would move the dial further from where we are to where you'd like us to be.
Well, firstly, I think we operate with legal clarity. So we have a very clear legal definition of what is illegal content. And that doesn't include pornography, for example, which is legal. And we don't deal with pornography. We only deal with images of children under 18, which are categorised in law in a certain way. So we have a legal clarity, which, say, the online harms white paper doesn't have, because the online harms paper talks about legal but harmful behaviour, which is something that I have no idea what that means. And I have no idea how a company is supposed to interpret that at the moment. I don't think the companies know how it's supposed to interpret it. So that's one lesson for the government in terms of the current legislation, to be very wary of going down that particular path. Secondly, we have a high level of technical skill. So we understand technology, and again, I think a good lesson of government is if you're going to legislate in a technical area, have people involved in the drafting of legislation who are engineers or have engineering backgrounds or skills, so you understand what it is you're doing when you draft that legislation, because we have that. We are a tech organisation, essentially, tech-enabled organisation. And thirdly, we have some very good internal processes in terms of, although we use crawlers and algorithms to find potential legal material, we don't send to companies you should remove it unless it's been inspected by an analyst. Everything we find is then quality assured, so 10% of every image we recommend being removed is reviewed by a quality assurance senior level person. We have an independent review by a judge every year who comes in and looks at the processes to make sure that we are compliant with the law and operating within the law. And as it happens, we're judicially reviewable. If someone wants to complain that we've removed something we shouldn't have done, they can, and they can take us to court. That's not happened for many, many years. So I think it does testify to the kind of process you need to deal with bad content, which is clear legal definitions, technical capacity, and a robust internal process for doing that complies insofar as it can with general principles of due process and natural justice. So I think those would be the lessons I would draw. They're actually quite hard to apply to other harms, because with terrorist content, I think it's much more fluid. What does constitute terrorist content? Incitement to violence, yes. Trolling, abusive behaviour, these are all much trickier areas to actually produce legislation on. But the danger is that governments will simply say, there's a problem, you companies have the responsibility to fix it, without defining what that fix should look like, and without giving that legal clarity. And then you're essentially creating a series of private censors. And what a private for-profit company will do will just remove everything that's contentious. I mean, if you look at the German law on hate speech, I've spoken to the Facebook manager who deals with Facebook in Germany, and he said, I just take everything down that someone complains about, and the German courts reinstate it a few days later because someone protests that it's an infringement of free speech. But I'd rather the courts reinstated something than I risk my company getting a massive fine on its turnover. Now, that's not a helpful relationship to build between business and government and the legal system. You want something a bit more sensible than that. So I think those are the lessons I would draw. And I think in the last few years, there's not, in the last kind of 9-10 years, there's not been no one's raised a significant issue that the IWF has removed something it should not have removed. No one's actually done that. No one's actually come forward and said that. So that's a testimony to the system that we will.
And I think what Andrew's just described works on the positive side as well. If technology and policy can work in harmony together, and if there is clear parameters of what we want to achieve, then we can also talk about responsible innovation and how do we create an environment that actually promotes and encourages responsible innovation. But I think at the moment what the UK is lacking slightly is what is our ultimate strategic goal for what type of internet we want to create, what type of what sort of type of technology we want to encourage, etc. And I think without that sort of strategic goal, and I think the digital charter was meant to provide that, but has somewhat sort of disappeared from public view, it then becomes very bitty and can become very fragmented, and then you have different regulators taking different approaches, defining things in a different way, which doesn't provide certainty for companies, whether they're established or startups. So I think we really need to, and hopefully the Regulatory Horizons Council, working with the CDEI and others, can do that by providing some of that sort of, here are our strategic objectives and here are the principles that how we can reach them.
I like what you're saying, because I'm a bit puzzled by the fact that in many other policies, environment, or whether you need to build an electric power plant or whatever, you got a risk impact assessment. You don't have this when it's about regulation in the internet. So in many cases, we see there is a lack of actually assessment of whether you achieve the goal that you want to achieve, whether you have the desired outcome, whether it's proportionate, when they will actually solve the problem for it. And I believe we're trying to work on this right now in the internet society. We would like to come up to government saying maybe there is time to assess and have these risk impact assessments. And I have taken some example, well, I didn't because I have not got no time. But whenever a government mandates providers to remove a website, like they did, for example, in Italy, asking Cloudflare to remove some website because they were deemed to be pirate. So Cloudflare, what they did, because Cloudflare is the CDN provider, they just removed the whole services. because they just cannot do anything else but that. So it was completely disproportionate. When you talk about DNS filtering or blocking a DNS, this is disproportionate because people still can access the content, etc. So what I believe we would like to promote is really a much more assessed policy when it's about the internet and including assessing the impact on it.
So I generally think there's kind of a balance issue. So between kind of prescriptive regulation and outcomes-focused regulation. So often, if regulation is quite prescriptive and it says you must do this, you must do this, you must do this, regulation and regulators get accused of kind of hindering innovation, essentially. So, we've kind of recommended in our white paper to move towards a more outcomes-focused system where the goal or the desired outcome is stated and how businesses get there is up to them. As you're saying, I think there's a balance to be gained from, kind of having that outcomes-focused system, but still providing enough guidance so businesses and innovators kind of know what they need to do to be able to comply. So I think it is kind of a balancing act, really.
And you can have an outcomes-based system with checks and balances along the way,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
With people who can, tell you, okay, you're on the right course, or have you thought about this, etc. It's not how you don't have to necessarily choose for being, okay, well, I'm going to either be prescriptive or outcomes-based, and we're only going to call you up once you've reached an outcome, and then at that point we'll say, no, actually that wasn't right. What you've done, there can be sort of guidance along the way, but it's how, again, it comes back to the point of how do you create a space where a business can go to the regulator and say, I'm not sure about this, who's my regulator here, am I working within the right parameters, what's your advice, etc. And so to help get to the right outcome that suits everyone.
I know we started a little bit late, but I'm also conscious of time, and we have some questions from the audience to get to as well. So I'm going to ask one more question for everyone to get the chance to respond to, and then take the questions. So could you draw on an example where you think policy and technology have worked well together, where there's been a good conversation at the right time with those right people in the room to achieve the kind of outcome that you think has been effective? And if you can't think of one, then just final thoughts that you want to share.
It's not just because I'm trying to flatter, but I would say the IWF is a really good example of that, because actually the IWF does, have one foot in policy, but also has been able to build the trust of sort of technology companies and others who are its members, and it's a really healthy relationship there.
I'd say fintech and data portability. And I think if you apply data portability across all the platforms, it would have a transformative effect economically and in terms of competition.
I would say, showing that I'm not only pessimistic, but there was some very good work that we've done with our chapter here in UK about IoT security and privacy with the CMS that end up with a remarkable recommendation about how to secure your IoT device. So that was a very good example.
So I'd probably say the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles and the Solicitors Regulation Authority are doing some great kind of forward-thinking work on regulating for autonomous vehicles, specifically kind of looking at insurance markets and things like that and how they might need to adapt in the future.
Are we using Slido, or are we going straight to the audience? Okay. Down in the front.
Yeah, so the red light shown.
Okay, that's better. So it's obviously a really interesting conversation about the sort of online harms white paper and that quite conceptual model. But I just wanted to bring it back to some specifics and looking at the IWF model and saying, if we're thinking about changes to technology like encryption and DOE, and whether you can just marry the two and look at some of the technology developments and then apply them in actual real cases. So the IWF is one type of filtering that's at the moment done in a decentralized way by UK ISPs. I mean, one of the solutions would clearly be if the block list was taken by centralized DOE providers. And the same conversation is happening across government in other areas whereby the government didn't quite get the technology at first, and they came up with some policies which didn't endure, and therefore things like age verification has been dropped because it wasn't comprehensive enough. But so just back to the original question: could centralised dough companies do the filtering, which goes against their principles, but it's one solution?
I mean, that might be a solution. I think we want to look at a range of technical solutions. One of the other ideas being looked at is photo-DNA, and whether that can be used inside encrypted channels without reading the content, but flagging up potential illegal content, because that's built into the photo-DNA image. So there's a number of things we want to look at. At the moment, we're not discussing them publicly. We're in conversation with the companies. I think I would like us to actually develop a more working relationship with the companies developing encryption technologies so that we can build a partnership with them to actually find solutions that work for what they're trying to achieve in the field of encryption, as well as what we're trying to achieve in terms of protecting children. And that's what I would hope to do in the next kind of year or two. And there's certainly, in my initial conversations with the companies, they're very receptive to doing that. They recognise the reputational damage to them of building an encrypted system that facilitates enhanced levels of child abuse is very, very severe.
Does anyone else want to come in on that? Okay. Right, we have a few questions from Slido. So the first one is around this issue of, okay, so you have tech developing in different countries, but it has implications internationally. So as technology develops, how can we ensure that it meets a country's policies when tech is international?
I mean, that's the $1 million question. So it comes down to how much are we paying attention as we develop policies at a domestic level about how they are perceived and how they are used by countries elsewhere, with perhaps countries with fewer democratic safeguards. And so I think it's about actually, as we move forward with developing policies, obviously that is for a national government to look at, but it's about, okay, particularly if you're going to try and be world leading in something, have you got one eye on how this can be applied elsewhere, and are you basically handing over almost a green light to a more authoritarian regime to do something similar? So I think it's actually one of the things is having that awareness, but also it's again for industries to speak up and say, right, this is how, this by introducing X piece of regulation or legislation, this is what you're opening me up to in other jurisdictions.
I think it's a geopolitical question now. I think big countries will have a big impact on the global internet. Small countries will have very little impact. The EU accounts for about a quarter of the revenue of the FANGs, so the EU can have a significant impact if it chooses a regulatory approach. Britain on its own would have a much smaller impact on the global internet if it chose to be outside the EU. That's just a fact.
Yeah, well, I mean, nothing to add to what you just said. But yeah, what you just said was part of what I describe as an intended consequence. Again, extraterritoriality of regulation. We got plenty of examples. I mean, if a judge in Germany asks Facebook or Google to remove something from the internet at global level, it has an impact on the global internet, not just in Germany. When Europe has a legislation or regulation, in this case on privacy, it has an impact on the rest of the world, hence the potential fragmentation of the internet, because if the other part of the world start to do the same, well, people just cannot rely on the internet that is end-to-end. So those kind of issues needs to be discussed.
But I mean, that can also have a positive impact. I think, GDPR is now often seen as the gold standard. And we're seeing global companies implement GDPR because they understand.
Absolutely.
That is, so, it's a give and take, but I think it was front and center of the GDPR discussion is, okay, well, what impact is this going to have at a global level? And if we're going to be world leading, let's have an eye to making sure that, what we build is the right, is sort of in the right direction at least.
I agree.
Okay, so the next question is, how do we reconcile the protection of children with the protection of dissidents? How do we stage open and honest debates on possible answers? So I guess this one's kind of leading at what we heard a little bit earlier about we're looking at behaviours, and actually context is quite important to behaviours, and the same thing might mean something very different in different places. I mean, I think it's a very difficult question, and we've already sort of touched on this issue of of legal harm, and how would we even begin to define that? Does anyone have any final points around those kind of tricky contextual issues?
I mean, I think a lot of that might come down to the interdisciplinarity question again. So it isn't just about involving ethicists and technical experts, anthropologists, philosophers, kind of bringing in lots of different expertise to explore those kind of the cross-cultural aspects or the different kind of aspects of internet safety. So, yeah.
Call out to the anthropologists to come to the IGF next year then.
I think it's also about recognising that there are probably no silver bullets in this space. And, you know, what we see as issues online are also issues offline that we deal with day in, day out as a society. So, for example, I think, you know, one of the striking examples is sort of the debate around anti-vaccination. And we're seeing a lot of that online, and there is, you know, no law that says this is not allowed and we are going to prosecute individuals who put up anti-vax material. So there are other you know, this is not simply about, okay, well, that means a company has to take it down. There are other things it can do. It can deprioritize, it can make sure that you know, it's not as easy to search for. It can surround that anti-vax material with signposting to recognised medical advice from the NHS or whatever, and this is what companies are doing now. So it's about seeing things in not such a black and white manner in the space of legal but harmful. And actually having that much more nuanced approach that sort of empowers users, but also is about sort of responsible tech.
And maybe there's actually something to learn from the kind of user journey of that tech companies are more used to thinking about for the policy area. Like, where do people get their advice around medicine? What are the other touch points where people come into contact thinking about vaccinations, and how can we make sure they're getting the right messages reinforced? Andrew?
Yeah, I think there's a gender dimension to some of this as well, because most of the most egregious harms, you know, the violent threats, the offensive behaviour, child sex abuse and something is perpetrated by men, not by women. And that's overwhelmingly true. I mean, it's not entirely 100% true, but it's overwhelmingly true. So there's something about men when they get online and they're allowed anonymity that causes a cohort of men to behave extremely badly towards other human beings, particularly towards women or towards minorities or vulnerable groups. And I think addressing that in our society, that's not a technical problem, that's not an internet-caused problem. It's a problem within men and male society, and I think that's something that as men we need to reflect on and address and come up with some ideas and thoughts about how we deal with that, quite independent of technology, because technology is simply amplifying and viralising and enhancing that behaviour. It's not causing it. And that behaviour has always been there, but obviously there's something going on here that I think gets relatively little discussed and relatively little addressed in public debate.
Yeah, and can I just say that it's really refreshing to hear that from a man at not a sort of, you know, D&I conference or whatever it might be. And so that's just really refreshing.
Thank you. So back to that kind of really complex human problems and the multidisciplinary approach. Okay, I'm going to... One more? Okay.
One more, please. My question is directed at... Is that Lindsay? Are you... Yeah. Okay, at the beginning you stated that technology is neutral, so I'd like to give you an example from my own personal experience. I have a UK biometric passport. At any UK airport, I'm not recognised. So the Home Office has admitted that its passport recognition services don't recognise people with dark skin, and yet that technology's been rolled out. So I think it's not right to, you know, make sweeping statements like, you know, technology is neutral when clearly, in my case, it's not.
I meant by that the technology itself is neutral. The people designing it and the people making it have bias, and they introduce bias into the technology when they make it. So I wasn't suggesting that technology, you know, when it's designed and everything is completely neutral, as in like the people behind it have their bias and they introduce that into it. So it was more of a technology in and of itself is neutral rather than that.
And I think in that particular instance, it's probably that actually the data behind it is really bad and not representative, etc. So it's, you know, the technology and data, particularly when it gets to things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc. It's not about just looking at the technology and making sure that the biases aren't there, but it's about looking at the data as well.
And perhaps are we also looking at, so there's a technology that recognises faces, but like you said, the data isn't right, but that doesn't mean we can't change how that technology has been implemented and perhaps correct some of the issues like the ones you're describing. Okay, final poll of the audience. Are we pessimistic or neutral? No. Okay, are we pessimistic or optimistic? I'm sorry, we've gone one more and we're already over time. I think we're going to have to call it here if we're going to get through the rest of it. I'm really sorry. Okay. Slido again. Are we pessimistic or optimistic? The bars aren't moving, guys. We haven't changed your thoughts at all. And we're... Is it... Slightly more optimistic. Oh, maybe not. Okay, well, it's been a very interesting discussion nonetheless. Thank you so much to all of our panel.
Thank you.